One of the greatest problems for a SENCO is trying to identify who does or does not belong on the SEN register. I can guarantee that within the groups I belong to that this question is asked at least 10 times a week, if not more. It comes down to our definition of special educational needs, those children who need something significantly different from or additional to their peers. In the EEF analysis, they concluded that all children have learning needs. The common needs are those which all children have. For example, they all need great input of high quality material from fantastic teachers. Some children have specific needs which are shared with a similar group. For example, the use of coloured overlays or a preferred font when presented with printed material. And some have individual needs, for example, a need for sensory breaks. If we exchange the word needs for the word barriers, then we're applying a social model of disability. It is the barrier that is removed or addressed in order to provide support. There is a very different and traditional model which we often get drawn into. How many of us will have that conversation at the beginning of each year? Yeah, but what have they got? This labelling can be both a help and a hindrance and comes from the medical model of disability whereby meeting a series of criteria, a label is awarded. However, that label is as generic as telling someone they have hair. Is it long? Is it short? Is it straight? Is it curly? Is it blonde? Is it red? Is it purple? Simply saying, oh, Fred is in your class, he has autism, could mean anything. Fred might be a high-flying student who just needs a little reassurance he is on track, prefers his own company to that of his peers, and generally does absolutely fine most of the time. Or Fred might be sensory seeking, working a long way below age-related expectations and struggling with non-verbal and verbal communication, and in need of significant levels of support to get through the day. Both Freds have autism. Some children without a diagnosis may be on our SEN register. Some children with a diagnosis may not be on the SEN register. Schools drive their SEN register through the needs-led process and they support that with the graduated approach. So when we return to school in its fullest sense, there will be a job to do in identifying those students who may now fall under our SEN banner. I worry that a lot of students will end up directed towards the SEN department when actually all they need is some great teaching and a few weeks of stability. Most of whom we do need to identify will fall into the broad area of need for social, emotional and mental health. We need to remember that having time off from school doesn't mean that children suddenly develop a cognition and learning need. Not in the same sense of the Special Educational Needs Code of Practice anyway. And if we apply a medical model, they certainly don't warrant a diagnosis of a cognition and learning label. This grid is in the EEF guide and it doesn't rely on that label, medical diagnosis, but again refers to that as social model of removing barriers, and it's what we need to do for all students. There are many voices to represent the school, the pupils and the parent. Like everything, we're great at gathering information, but what do we do with it? This is one suggestion. A plan for each student who is flagged as red or at high risk of not recovering well relative to other pupils in the school from the effects of COVID absences. It's simply identifying the things that already exist in school that might support or where something bespoke is required. If you intend using the tutor funding allocation, this approach would allow you to identify who and what as a priority list. Of course, we don't want paperwork for paperwork's sake, and this could easily be whipped up as a spreadsheet with the names down one side and the provision on offer across the top. Again, it will help schools to prioritise what needs to be in place and identify their groups. As I'm sure that we are all missing the beautiful curves displayed by our government for COVID statistics, I thought we'd have our own version. In our case, we don't want to flatten the curve, we want to peak the curve in as narrow a range as possible and shift it to the right at the same time. There will always be a normal distribution curve when we look at any piece of pupil data. Someone will always come out on top and someone, usually me, will be at the bottom. Whenever we put our efforts into improving things, we generally shift the curve to the right as opposed to actually narrowing the gap between the bottom and the top. Some children are still at the bottom, but the gap between them and the ones at the top is what we're actually trying to reduce. This is where our interventions, provisions and support come in. So the first thing will be ensuring that we have robust and secure transition processes in place, not just now. It's all well and good running transition now, but if we apply the same theory that is being bandied about forgetting everything in the 6-week break, then we're going to have to do it again in September anyway. What else do we need to look at and consider? Well, relationships with other professionals and SENCOs. Over the last few months, I think a lot of SENCO families have been created, and there's a realisation that although there's only one SENCO in each school, for most schools, which can feel lonely, there are over 20,000 SENCOs in England alone, so not quite that lonely. It's worth building on those relationships and not forgetting them, especially as things continue to change. Risk assessments back in March threw a lot of mainstream SENCOs who perhaps previously only used a risk assessment for a school trip, an evacuation procedure, or where a child exhibited extreme behaviour. The regular effective use of risk assessments for learners and a more joined up approach with parents on how these might look could possibly support many schools in supporting their more challenging pupils and maybe even avoid some exclusions. Online learning has been a major success for some groups of SEND learners in many establishments, especially those at SEN support stage, where we perhaps sometimes struggled to provide support in school. We should look to be bringing some of that back into school with us. The monitoring and tracking of learners could also be linked with parental communication. Some of our students we will not have seen for the last 6 months. We need to find out what they've been doing and what they've struggled with. There's a suggestion from research done by one local authority that in some schools the teaching staff have become more involved with students with SEND, and therefore there's an increased understanding of their needs, something that we've actually been battling with for years if we're honest. And the internet has of course gone CPD crazy, and schools have benefited from a range of opportunities that staff have had access to. Some schools have used this to design bespoke programmes for TAs and teachers to maximise the opportunities, and many have not only used the training but then made sure it's been evaluated and reviewed, establishing if it's fit for purpose. The question now is how schools are maybe going to develop that next layer of CPD. Has this glut of learning allowed pupils with SEND to have access to increased opportunities? And if so, how can it be continued into the next academic year? It's all well and good studying the course, but now it needs to translate into practice. Okay, well, if I had £1, no, never mind that, a penny, for every time someone has asked, how do I use TAs, I'd be taking a break until the middle of 2021. If you have a question about teaching assistants and how best to deploy them or use them, then you go to the expert on maximising their impact. So I asked Professor Rob Webster of University College London for his thoughts. In terms of what the effective use of TAs will look like, the focus, as we know, will be very much on catch-up as pupils go back and schools begin to identify and get to grips with the gaps in learning. In other words, how far they've fallen behind. The strength of the research evidence plays strongly into thinking and planning around how schools could deploy TAs as part of a wider catch-up strategy by delivering structured interventions, which is essentially following recommendations 5 to 7 in the EEF guidance on TAs. That's not the one we were discussing earlier, it's a different one, link on the screen. Schools would have to think about implementation in terms of how delivery interacts with maintaining bubbles, though if the groups are year group based it should be okay, as most intervention groups seem to be run that way as it is. Natalie was thinking on the same lines and produced an article about this last week, and the link is available for you to have a read, although I am reminded of Shakespeare and witches now every time I see bubble mentioned more than once on a page. Rob directed me towards a really brilliant video by Andy Samways, the director of Unity Research School, which is based on one element of the EEF report, which draws attention to how TAs can help and promote and develop pupils' independence via effective interactions in the context of physical distancing. The scaffolding triangle he references in that video is in the EEF guidance, and I really do suggest you watch it and see how much of it can be applied to your school and your context. For me, it wasn't that it was just a sensible suggestion and played into the hands of distanced support, but actually it was about giving students skills they can take on and further develop, a life skill rather than patching a problem. The concept isn't new. Scaffolding has been around for a while, but it's always nice to have a refresher on least support first and its application in our new set of circumstances. The whole thing just makes sense, and if you're allowed to run a CPD in September, this is one that's already been written for you. Ultimately, everything will boil down to teachers providing consistently high quality teaching and schools resisting the temptation to give those who are furthest behind more TA support at the expense of time with their teacher. If you haven't heard of Rob and the Maximising TAs research, then do look up the website for some fantastic information, and that's the maximisingtas.co.uk.